These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's queen has a check that must be seen. Queen checks always must at least be seen. Queen moves to b4. When you examine a queen check, you are looking in part for forking ideas. The question is whether queen moves to b4 attacks anything else. Not directly, no, but from b4 the queen is aimed at the knight on h4, which is loose and therefore a target. The problem is the white pawn on f4. Can it be eliminated? Best would be to take something the f4 pawn protects, but that's not going to work here. In reply to knight takes at e5, white has queen takes knight, check. So toy with more direct threats to see what they do. Thus pawn from g6 moves to g5 is natural to consider, and then you see that it does more than threaten the white pawn. It attacks the knight, too, which has no safe place to flee, an occupational hazard of a knight placed on the edge of the board. So white is about to lose the knight unless he takes the black pawn that threatens it, yet if he plays pawn from f4 takes at g5 he loses the knight anyway to black's queen fork. Queen moves to b4, check. White also can reply to black's initial pawn push with queen moves to d4, preparing queen takes at a4. Or white can play too. Knight takes at f5, queen takes knight. The material outcome is the same. There is a matter of move order to consider. Black could start with queen moves to b4, check. Forcing king moves to c1. Then comes pawn from g6 moves to g5, and again white must lose the knight. In effect white's f-pawn is now pinned. Why not do it this way? Well, you could. But now if white plays 2. Knight takes at f5, black can't recapture with his queen, for it is over on b4. Instead black has to recapture with his e6 pawn, which in turn gives white a passed pawn on e5 that he can push to e6, threatening to promote it eventually and menacing black's knight right away. Black can deal with this. One possibility is queen moves to e7, pinning the pawn, another is queen moves to c5, attacking white's queen, but starting with pawn from g6 moves to g5 avoids these complications. White to move. What is the best move? Black has a loose rook at d7, a target. White's queen can attack it by moving to h3, g4, or f5. You attack rooks diagonally, and bishops horizontally or vertically, but none of these moves attacks anything else at the same time. the path to the king is blocked by the pawns in front of it. So consider what other resources white can bring to bear, what forcing moves, and with what results. Experiment with the knight. It has an easy fork with the check. Knight moves to f6, check. Black has to reply pawn from g7 takes knight, not only to avoid losing the rook but to avoid being mated with queen takes at h7. But then a line to the king has been opened, now queen moves to g4, check. Attacks both king and rook, winning the exchange. If you need to move an enemy pawn, whether in front of its king or elsewhere, the most common method is to take something it protects. But another technique to remember, shown here, is to imagine sticking one of your pieces and prize to the pawn and consider whether it makes an interesting threat that your opponent would feel obliged to extinguish, thus leaving you with an open line on which to play a tactic. Or maybe he will decide that he can't afford to extinguish the threat by making a capture because its side effects are too severe, i.e., the queen fork, so instead he has to let you push your first threat forward. White to move. What is the best move? This is similar to the previous frame. What black pieces are loose? The knight at a5 and the rook at e2. It would be hard to fashion a double attack against the knight, but the rook, isolated deep in white's territory and near the white queen, is a perfect target. Is there a square white's queen can reach that would enable it to attack black's king and rook at the same time? If the queen were on g4 it would be aimed at both targets. But its path to the king would be blocked by the pawn at g7, and of course the white knight already occupies g4. What white needs is a way for the knight to vacate g4 with a capture or threat that requires black to respond, and a way to remove the pawn at g7. Knight takes at f6 and knight moves to h6 suggest themselves as ways to achieve both objectives at once. Knight takes at f6 doesn't quite do it because black can reply queen takes knight without moving the g7 pawn. But knight moves to h6, check. Forks queen and king and so requires pawn from g7 takes knight in response, after which queen moves to g4, check. Forks and takes the black rook. White to move. What is the best move? This position illustrates a very useful principle. White has a queen aimed at h7. If the queen had cover from another white piece aimed at the same square, the result would be a mating threat. A classic way to so aim a second piece is by putting a bishop behind the queen, as with one. Bishop moves to d3. There is then a standard way for black to address such a threat. He moves his g-pawn forward to g6, interrupting the queen's path, and, in this case, threatening it to boot. but the point of the mate threat wasn't to mate. It was to force this disruption of the pawn cover in front of black's king. When pawns step forward as black's g-pawn does here, lines to the king often are opened that can then be used for other tactical purposes such as forks. In this case notice that black has a loose bishop on d6, after the little sequence just sketched white takes the bishop with 2. Queen moves to f6, check. Rook moves to g7, interposing to block the check, 3. Queen takes bishop. The pattern here is important to master, lining up pieces against the enemy king's position so he is forced to move his pawns forward, then exploiting the line he has opened with a fork or other tactic. White to move. What is the best move? See the loose rook on c8. See the exposed enemy king on h8. See that in one move your own queen nearly can get into position to attack both targets with queen moves to h4. Neither part of the attack works yet, the point is just to recognize this as a common general pattern for a queen fork, the check against the exposed king down the side of the board, and the accompanying diagonal attack against a loose piece on the back rank. The question is whether it can be made effective. The pawn on h5 blocks the queen's path on the h-file, and the fork would have to be executed from g4 anyway in order to reach the loose rook, or else the rook would have to be moved. Well, getting the pawn out of the way is no great challenge, just take what it protects with 1. Rook takes knight. After pawn from h5 takes rook, white can work with checks and thus is in the driver's seat. 2 queen moves to h4, check. Forcing black's king to the g-file, then 3. Queen takes at g4, check. The fork, and 4. Queen takes rook. So white gets a pawn, a knight, and a rook for a rook if black bites by recapturing after white starts with rook takes knight. He probably won't, which is fine, it leaves you with a piece. But you also have to make sure that he doesn't have any killer threats of his own to play instead, and at this point the position becomes more demanding than at first appears. Look at any checks black can play and not just the first check he can give, but strings of checks. You need to satisfy yourself that you can escape whatever mess he can create. Imagine him replying to rook takes knight with queen moves to a2, check. This forces your king to c2, then comes black's next check, pawn from b4 moves to b3, check. This time your king escapes to d1, and black is out of checks. He can play queen takes at b2, but since that's not a check it leaves you with a move to take your rook on g4 out of the danger it still faces from the pawn on h5. That last point is important. The purpose of looking at black's counter threats is partly to make sure you aren't leaving yourself open to a mating trap, but it's also to make sure that black can't play any forcing moves, checks, mate threats, or captures, that will force you to move your queen, for remember that while all this action is going on in the near left corner of the board, your rook still has been left en prize to black's pawn on h5. The only thing preventing your rook from being taken is the threat of the queen fork discussed in the first paragraph. If black can find a way to distract your queen, your rook will be a goner because black will be able to take it without consequence. But he can't. There is yet one more possibility you would need to consider. Black can reply to rook takes at g4 with pawn from b4 moves to b3. Again, you are looking for major counter threats black could launch, this counts as one of them because once the pawn has moved to b3 it is ready to support mate by the queen on a2. The pawn move also uncovers the threat of queen takes queen next move. Black might be thinking that this will force white to make the preemptive strike too. Queen takes queen, then after black replies rook takes queen, the queens have been traded and black is ready to launch a mate threat of his own with our pawn from c8 moves to a8, preparing rook moves to a1, checkmate. But this needn't scare you, for white has another move to play in the middle of that sequence. If 2. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen, then white goes with 3. Our pawn from c1 moves to h1. This pins the pawn on h5, so now white's rook at g4 is safe. More to the point, with rooks on both the g and h files white suddenly is ready to mate with rook takes at h5. Indeed, black cannot escape that result. This position is worth a good look as a study in anticipating your opponent's counterplay. The reason the issue needs such close consideration here is that white's king is so exposed. It's next to an open file on which black has a queen and rook, and its only flight square, c2, is perilously close to being sealed off by black's b-pawn. This means that white has to be very careful not to end up mated or otherwise burned by operations against his king's position. It can happen at any time, even in the middle of a tactical sequence white initiates elsewhere on the board. White to move. What is the best move? Now let's try some cases where there is more than one complication to address. Here we will start to see some problems where none of the ingredients of a fork is obviously in place at the beginning. This makes spotting the potential for a double attack harder. Instead of looking for obvious tip-offs like loose pieces the queen can attack or available checks, we have to use a little more imagination. We look for familiar visual patterns and we examine checks, captures, and threats, searching for signs that a fork is coming into view. In the position pictured here, ask whether black has any loose pieces. You thus are led to the knight at e4. White can't attack it and give check at the same time. Indeed, white has no checks at all. But if white's queen moved to a4 it would be close to executing the classic pattern seen at the beginning of the chapter, attacking the king and a loose piece on the 4th or 5th rank. The queen at least would be aimed at both pieces, with its path to the king blocked by the knight at c6 and its path to the loose knight at e4 blocked by its own pawn at d4. So white looks for ways to get rid of those blockages, preferably at the same time. He starts by moving the obstruction he can control, his own d4 pawn, and using it to threaten the obstruction controlled by the enemy. Thus pawn from d4 moves to d5 attacks the knight and forces it to move out of the way. Now queen moves to a4, check. Wins the knight at e4. Black to move. What is the best move? White has a loose bishop at a4, and also two loose rooks which are less accessible. Is there a square from which black's queen would be aimed at both the bishop and white's king? H4 is an interesting start, as from there the queen could give check and would win the bishop if the e4 pawn weren't in the way, always assuming black's queen could get to h4 past the knight at f6. So black begins playing with ways to move both the knight and the e4 pawn out of the way. The natural method is to use the knight to attack something the e4 pawn protects, like the d5 pawn. 1. Knight takes at d5, and then if white replies pawn from e4 takes knight. 2. Black queen moves to h4, check. Wins the bishop. You might just as well have seen this by playing with any captures you can make and asking what would be possible on the board as it would look afterwards. This leads you to knight takes at d5. After imagining the recapture pawn from e4 takes knight, you look for any new checks you would be able to give and see the fork queen moves to h4, check. Black to move. What is the best move? White has no loose pieces and black's queen has no checks. But we examine the consequences of every check as a matter of course, and here black has two of them. Knight takes bishop and knight moves to f3. Knight moves to f3, check. Leads nowhere. White plays pawn from g2 takes knight. But what happens after knight takes bishop, check? White has to play queen takes knight to recover his piece. That little exchange would mean a significant change in the position. Black's knight and white's bishop both would be gone, and white's queen would be moved to e2. So rethink what would then be possible, noting any lines that would have been opened, any checks they would make possible, and any white pieces that would have been left loose. Black would be able to deliver a check with queen moves to d4, and at the same time attack white's newly loosened knight at c3, a perfect double attack, winning a piece. White to move. What is the best move? White has no queen checks and black has no loose pieces, except his queen, which generally is not a suitable target for a queen fork. Again, though, it is our practice to examine every check of any sort, and here white has one, bishop takes knight, which leads to king takes bishop. Alright, now examine the board as it would look after that exchange, and re-ask the important questions: what checks now would be available, and what loose pieces? There are two checks, queen moves to d3 and queen moves to c2. The interesting one is queen moves to d3, because it also attacks the black bishop on d5. The bishop is protected once, by black's queen. But notice that now it would be attacked twice, by the white queen and rook. So queen moves to d3, check. Wins the bishop after black's king retreats. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a more challenging one. Black has no loose pieces except his rooks, which are tucked out of danger, and white has no checks to give. The most likely way to see the chance for a double attack here is to experiment with captures and their consequences. There is just one possible capture here for white, knight takes at d5, which more or less requires black to play pawn from c6 takes knight. Then how would the board look? What checks would then be available? Answer: queen moves to b5, which would attack the bishop at b4 as well as the king. The bishop is protected by black's queen. But it also would already be attacked once by the white bishop at d2. Remember that when you think of knight takes at d5, you imagine the knight gone from its current square and see the open lines that result. So the black bishop would be as good as loose, after black moves his king in response to queen moves to b5, check. White plays bishop takes bishop and black dares not recapture. The tricky part of this example is seeing the potential for a double attack at all, since none of the ingredients are visible at the start. But even from the beginning you might notice a basic pattern that is familiar by now. By moving to b5 the queen would be aimed at the enemy king and would have black's bishop just underneath it. Double attacks by the queen often look like that. It doesn't quite work yet because the pawn at c6 blocks the check and protects the needed square, and because the bishop is protected once and not yet attacked at all. Still, if you can see the rough outlines of the familiar pattern, you can then play with various forcing moves on the board, like knight takes at d5, with a view to making the queen fork effective. You also might see the tactical idea here by first observing that knight takes at d5 is a knight fork of black's queen and bishop. Since the black bishop would also then be attacked once by white's bishop, the knight fork is a real threat to black and must be met with pawn from c6 takes knight. This then becomes a problem similar to the knight forks we already studied, where you imagine playing the attack knowing that it will fail when your knight gets taken. You ask what would then be possible, and particularly what checks you would have available. Here that inspection would turn up a check by the queen which also attacks the bishop for the second time. White to move. What is the best move? Here is another trickier position. Black has two loose pieces, the rook and the knight. The knight is out of reach, but what about the rook? It almost seems that it could be taken for free by the queen right now. Then black plays queen takes knight, attacking white's queen, and white has the exchange to show for his trouble. But remain calm and see if you can find something that is better still. Don't assume the first good move you find is the best one possible. The queen has no good checks here, but the geometry of black's position should be provocative. Queen takes rook aims the queen at black's king and also attacks the bishop at a5, which would then, i.e., with the rook captured, be left loose. So see if you can move your knight away from e6 with a threat. The first type of threat to consider is a check. Knight moves to g5, check. Is no good, as it gives black a way to both extinguish the check, save the rook, and guard the targeted piece, the bishop on a5, in one stroke. Rook takes knight. So now consider your other knight check. One knight moves to d8, check. In reply to which black has to either take the knight with his queen or else move his king. If he plays one queen takes knight, white has two. Queen takes rook, forking black's king and bishop and winning a rook with the sequence. If black instead moves his king to f8 or g8 in reply to the knight check, the results for him are even worse. If the king goes to g8, it still gets checked by queen takes rook and mate follows soon for white. If black moves his king instead to f8, then after queen takes rook white can hold off on queen takes bishop and instead move his own rook over to the h-file and prepare to drop it to h8, creating havoc there, likely in the form of a skewer. For now, though, it is enough to have seen the power of the initial move knight moves to d8. The challenge of this problem, a bit like the challenge of the previous one, is that white ends up taking a piece that was not loose at the start by inflicting a check that also was not available at the start. There are various ways you might have spotted the idea: by recognizing the relationship between black's bishop and king, which looks like a lot of other double attacks we have seen, or by examining every check from the outset, standard practice, finding knight moves to d8, check. And seeing that afterwards queen takes rook wins the bishop, or by seeing that even if the bishop at a5 is not loose, it would become loose as soon as white played queen takes rook with only the white knight standing in the way of a good fork. You look for ways the knight can evacuate its square with check, and there you have it. White to move. What is the best move? Again we begin with no possible checks for white and no loose black pieces, except the queen, which makes a bad target, and bishop, against which nothing is possible. Still, we do have some familiar geometry. Queen moves to d5 aims the queen at both the black king and the rook at a8. Neither side of the attack yet works, but the basic pattern is something to keep in mind. The next step is to experiment with checks. White has none, and with captures. The obvious spot for an exchange is f5, where black has a knight that white attacks. How many times is it attacked, and how many times protected? Twice and twice. So white imagines 1. Knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, 2. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop. Here is the key moment in the exercise. Imagine the board after those exchanges, and re-ask what checks and loose pieces are available. Now queen moves to d5 looks quite different. It's a check, and the rook at a8 would be loose and so would be lost to the double attack. This problem is a good illustration of two things: how much a couple of exchanges that don't seem to do much by themselves can change the board, and the importance of asking simple questions about how the board will look after such exchanges are complete. Take the opportunity of this position to think, too, about the coordination of black's pieces and white's disruption of it. In the diagram, black's pieces protect each other nicely, his rooks guard each other, and his bishop guards both knights and prevents white from giving check on d5. With a couple of exchanges, white ruins this coordination, suddenly leaving black's position much more exposed to brutal tactical shots. It shows how vulnerable a position can be when pieces are protected by other pieces, rather than pawns. A series of captures can force the pieces all over the board and rather abruptly leave one or two of them loose. White to move. What is the best move? Using mate threats. Often the queen can attack a loose piece while at the same time not checking the enemy king but threatening mate. The enemy has to address the mating threat, so the loose piece is lost just as it would be if the queen had delivered a check. To master this pattern, it is important to understand a couple of principles about mating threats and how to spot them. It usually takes two pieces to create a mating threat, or mate itself, of course. The threat of a back rank mate is a prominent exception, but for now just think about a classic set of cases that does follow the pattern. Your queen is poised to attack a square next to the enemy king that already is attacked by one of your other pieces. At the same time, your queen attacks a loose piece. Your opponent has to defuse the mate threat just as he would a check, giving you a move to take down the target. The diagram to the left illustrates the idea in skeletal form. White has a bishop trained on g7. His queen can threaten mate by jumping to d4 or g4 because either move creates the possibility of queen takes at g7, checkmate. Those mate threats will make a fine anchor for a queen fork of any loose pieces black leaves within range of d4 or g4. The white x's in the diagram thus indicate squares that white indirectly controls because of the possible fork. He already controls d7 with his queen, but imagine a pawn on d2 and the control again becomes indirect. If black leaves a loose piece on any of them, or even a piece defended once but also attacked once by another white piece, white may be able to win it by playing one of his two mate threats, queen moves to d4 or queen moves to g4. Black will have to respond to the mate threat by stepping forward one of the pawns in front of his king or in some other way, and then white will win the target. In addition to taking black pieces left unguarded on those squares, white also can carry out other operations there, exchanges, or putting his own pieces onto the squares, with more confidence than might appear to the untrained eye. In real play, the details of what white can do here naturally will depend on which piece black has left on those vulnerable squares, and of course on other pieces on the board that will complicate the picture. The e6 square is defended by a pawn. White wouldn't be able to use his queen to attack a bishop on a diagonal, etc. Or suppose black has a loose bishop on b4 and white forks it with queen moves to d4 or queen moves to g4. Black can save his piece by playing the bishop back to f8, this both removes it from danger and adds a defender to g7, thus defusing the mate threat. But these are details. The important thing for now is just to realize that in this humble-looking formation white has a strong forking threat waiting to be unleashed, that it isn't related to any check he can give, and that it gives him a measure of control over many squares that appear not to be under attack. White to move. What is the best move? Inspect the position for loose pieces and you find the black knight on c6. White has no safe way to check the king and attack the knight at the same time. Queen moves to e8 would do it, of course, but black's queen guards the square. So next white looks for a way to attack the knight while threatening mate. Look for another white piece trained on a square near the king. Here we have a classic example that we will see several times in this section. White's bishop is attacking a square next to the black king, h7. If white's queen moves in front of the bishop on the same diagonal, i.e., to g6, then white threatens mate on the next move. Queen moves to h7, checkmate. So black will have to address the threat created by queen moves to g6 by moving his king or bringing over his queen. Meanwhile, queen moves to g6 also attacks the loose knight. So after black makes one of the replies just described, white plays queen takes knight and takes the knight for free. Think of this as a double attack on the knight and on the h7 square. White to move. What is the best move? Here is the same principle in slightly different form. What black pieces are loose? The knight at a7 and bishop on d7. White can't give check and attack either piece at the same time, so he asks whether he might attack one of them while creating a mate threat. He looks for pieces he has trained on squares next to the king and sees that the bishop at a1 is aimed at h8. If white's queen were to land on h8, the game would be over. So white just needs a square from which his queen can, a, attack one of black's loose pieces, and, b, attack the h8 square. Queen moves to d4, winning the knight, is the answer. White to move. What is the best move? By now this one should be easy. Begin with the usual reconnaissance of enemy pieces, looking for any that are unguarded or underdefended. Here it turns up the black knight on e3. White can't give check and attack the knight at the same time, so he looks for the makings of a mate threat, another piece that attacks a square next to the king. Once more his bishop answers the purpose, it attacks g7. So he looks for ways his queen might attack g7, the mating square and the loose black knight. He finds queen moves to d4, which wins the piece. As these first examples all show, a bishop aimed at squares next to the enemy king can be a valuable resource, as it creates a fertile climate for double attacks with the queen. The mating threats it supports may be simple to defuse. Here the simple pawn move f6 puts out the fire for black, but of course the purpose of the exercise never was to deliver mate. It was to take loose enemy material. Black to move. What is the best move? What white pieces are loose? The rook at e1, as well as the queen, but focus on the rook for the usual reasons. Black has no safe way to check the white king and attack the rook at the same time, so he looks for a mating threat. Here as before the bishop is the answer, it attacks the b2 square, and pawn, adjacent to the king. Black would mate if his queen were to land on that square. If you followed the pattern of the previous problems, you might look for a way to put the queen on the same diagonal as the bishop, for example, by playing queen moves to d4. But that doesn't attack the rook, and anyway d4 is protected by white's queen. So black looks for other squares his queen could reach that would allow it to attack b2. He finds queen moves to b4, which threatens mate by queen takes at b2 and also threatens, and wins, the loose rook at e1. The point: there is more than one way for the queen to attack a mating square already being hit by a bishop. White to move. What is the best move? What black pieces are loose? All of them. White has no way to check the black king and attack any of those pieces at the same time, so he looks for a mating threat. He asks what other pieces he has attacking squares near the king. This time his bishop isn't helpful, but his knight is. It attacks g7. If white's queen were to land on that square, it would be mate. So white looks to move his queen to a square that would allow it to attack g7 and also attack one of the loose black pieces. This leads to queen moves to g5, which wins the rook after black makes a move to protect against queen takes at g7, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? The only loose black piece is the bishop at a1. White can't attack it and give check at the same time, so he looks for mating threats. His knight attacks f7 and h7. The attack on f7 is not powerful because black protects the square with his rook as well as his king, but h7 is only protected by black's king. It follows that if white's queen attacks h7 it will threaten mate, the h7 square thus can be treated a target in the same way a loose piece or the king itself would be. So the question for white is whether his queen can attack the black bishop and the h7 square at the same time. It can. Queen moves to h1 threatens mate and so wins the bishop. The long backward move of the queen here is counterintuitive, and illustrates the importance of methodically looking at every way the queen can attack the vulnerable points in the enemy position. White to move. What is the best move? White's best move obviously is the free queen takes knight. Or is it? This is a sterling example of the importance of looking beyond a good move to make sure there isn't a better one. Do it in the usual way, look for loose enemy pieces, checks, and mate threats. Black's rook is loose, follow this observation by looking for a line the queen could use to attack it while also being aimed at the king. Queen moves to h4 suggests itself. The move seems to fail because the h6 pawn blocks your queen's path to the black king's position. But there is more than one way for a fork to work. If the move doesn't give check, it still is enough if it threatens mate. Examine the black king's position and you see that white's rook on the open g-file has the king trapped on the side of the board, and you see as well that the king has no defenders. The conclusion, queen takes at h6 would be mate. So after white's won. Queen moves to h4, black doesn't dare move his rook, he has to let it go. Then again, no matter what black does, white can force mate soon enough anyway. If black plays 1. Black king moves to h7, for example, then white plays queen takes rook and can't be stopped from playing queen moves to g8, checkmate. Black can only delay the move with useless gestures like knight moves to e8 or queen takes at b3, check. White to move. What is the best move? Black just played bishop moves to c5, adding a second attacker against f2 along with his knight. Maybe he meant to threaten a knight fork there. To see why this was a mistake, look at the board from white's standpoint and ask some standard questions. What mating threat can white make? His bishop attacks f7, a square next to the king and unprotected by any piece other than the king, so white asks whether his queen can add to the pressure against that square and attack any loose black pieces at the same time. The answers are yes and yes. If white plays queen moves to d5, he now has a mating threat, and he also attacks the loose black knight at e4. The knight can jump out of the way and help guard f7 with knight moves to g5, but it's no escape. White already has g5 under attack twice. So after 1. Queen moves to d5. Black is obliged to lose material. He can play the check. Bishop takes at f2, check. So that his bishop takes a pawn with it on the way down, but then white calmly plays king moves to e2, and now two of black's pieces are under attack, his e4 knight by white's queen, and his bishop by white's king. He will lose the knight next move. Lesson: leaving loose pieces around is dangerous business. Before putting his bishop on c5, black should have noticed, a, that he already had a loose piece in the middle of the board, which always is cause for concern, and, b, that white had a bishop attacking f7, which is cause for additional concern since it sets up a mating threat if white can aim his queen at the square as well. Black would have been better off making a move to address one of those threats. Best is pawn from d7 moves to d6, since then after 1. Queen moves to d5, bishop moves to e6, 2. Queen takes knight, pawn from d6 moves to d5. Black wins back his piece with a pawn fork. We will look at pawn forks more closely in the later chapter dedicated to them. White to move. What is the best move? Let's continue to look at the same idea from a defensive standpoint. Here white sees that black's pawn on e5 is defended once, by the pawn on d6, and attacked twice, by the pawn on f4 and the knight on f3. So he is tempted to play 1. Pawn from f4 takes at e5, then f1. Pawn from d6 takes at e5, 2. Knight takes at e5. But please don't play an exchange like this until you have imagined what the board would look like afterwards, including what lines would then be open, and with what tactical opportunities then available to you or your opponent. One warning sign is that at the end of the sequence white's knight on e5, while not attacked, would be loose. Another is that black's bishop already attacks f2, adjacent to white's king. Nothing except the king protects that square, a common state of affairs in the opening. This is why f2 and f7 often are considered defensive weak spots early in a game, so if black's queen were able to attack f2 as well, white suddenly would be confronted with a mating threat. The threat could be averted with various moves, but they would take time, and meanwhile black would be able to take any loose piece his queen also attacked. None of this looks like an immediate worry in the position diagrammed here, but after the exchange of pawns and the recapture knight takes at e5 by white, the stage would be set for queen moves to d4, threatening mate at f2 and attacking, and winning, the then loose knight on e5. Black to move. What is the best move? Here's yet another example of how the prospect of queen forks can figure into defensive thinking. The two sides are fighting for control of the center and especially of the e4 square. Black sees that the white pawn there is protected twice but that he attacks it 3 times. In his mind's eye he plays 1. Knight takes at e4, 2. Bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, 3. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook. But before executing the sequence he must ask the sorts of questions we have been discussing. First, would this liquidation of the position leave any open lines at the end that would allow the enemy queen to attack the black king? Here queen moves to g5 would be available to white, and from there the queen would join the f5 knight in attacking g7 threatening mate. Indeed, that move already is available. What prevents it from working is the absence of a second target. The queen would be aimed at the rook on d8, but its path would be blocked and the rook would be guarded. But after the exchanges black imagines on e5, these obstacles would be gone. Indeed, the resulting position would be one you saw about 5 frames ago. It leaves a fork for white. So the sequence black imagines must not be played. After it is complete it results in 4. Queen moves to g5, king moves to f8, 5. Queen takes rook, check. Queen moves to e8, 6. Queen takes knight. This example shows how a few precautionary questions, asked as a matter of course before entering into a series of exchanges, can save a lot of trouble at the end. You carefully imagine how the board would look after the series, including any new open lines and loose pieces, and you then ask the same questions about that resulting position that you ask about positions in front of you. Would either side have any loose pieces that could be attacked while giving check or threatening mate? If this seems like a demanding position, note again that the mate threat queen moves to g5 is available to white from the beginning. Both sides should be conscious of this. It means that if white's queen were able to attack anything loose from g5 he would have a working fork, so any sequences black attempts have to be inspected to make sure they don't produce that outcome. The moral: if your opponent is a move away from being able to create a mate threat, no matter how ineffectual, keep a careful eye on it as the potential basis of a fork.